They laughed at it first. Not openly. Not where I could quote them, but loud enough that the message was clear. Smirks at meetings. Side comments in emails. Jokes dressed up as concern. Overkill, one board member called it. Paranoid, another said. The HOA president smiled and added, "Some people just like to live in fear." What they were talking about was my safety setup. Reinforced supports under the house. Updated drainage channels. Retaining walls that actually matched the soil grade instead of pretending gravity didn't exist. Extra anchors. Extra inspections. Extra money spent where most people preferred not to look. I lived at the edge of the development, where the land dropped and the water moved. Where storms didn't just pass through, they collected. I'd watched the ground shift over the years, subtle but undeniable. Hairline cracks. Slight settling. Nothing dramatic yet. When I brought it up at an HOA meeting, they waved it off. "Our engineers signed off on everything years ago," the president said. "You're worrying about theoretical problems." I wasn't. I'd paid for my own assessment. A boring, meticulous report full of numbers no one wanted to read. It didn't predict disaster, but it outlined risk. Load stress. Drainage failure under extreme conditions. Cascading effects if one structure failed before the others. That last part mattered. I shared the summary. I suggested, calmly, that the HOA consider upgrades. Better drainage. Inspections after heavy weather. Preventive reinforcement in the most vulnerable areas. They didn't like that. Preventive spending isn't popular. It doesn't feel heroic. There's nothing to point at when it works. No ribbon to cut. Just money gone and nothing happening. So they voted it down. Not just down, dismissed. The president made a joke about bunkers and asked if I planned to install a moat next. A few people laughed. Most stayed quiet. After that, the emails started. "Your modifications are unnecessary. They may affect community aesthetics. Please submit additional documentation justifying these changes." I did. Every time. Permits. Inspections. Approvals. Photos. Engineer stamps. Everything was compliant. They still mocked it. At one point, the president said, half joking, half not, "When something actually happens, we'll see whose house stands." That line stayed with me, because I wasn't building for appearances. I wasn't trying to be right in a meeting. I was preparing for something everyone else preferred to believe wouldn't come. And the thing about risk is this. It doesn't announce itself politely. It doesn't wait for consensus. And it doesn't care who laughed last. So, I finished my setup. Quietly. Legally. Thoroughly. And then I waited. Not for validation. For weather. The forecast didn't look dramatic at first. Heavy rain. Sustained winds. A weather advisory buried halfway down the page like an afterthought. Nothing that triggered emergency alerts or school closures. The kind of storm people complain about and then forget. I noticed something else. The ground was already saturated. 2 weeks of steady rain had turned the soil into a sponge, and the drainage maps I'd studied, the ones the HOA said were outdated, were flashing warning signs in my head. Water doesn't need to be violent to be destructive. It just needs nowhere to go. The night before the storm, I did one last walkthrough. Checked the retaining walls. Cleared the drainage channels. Verified the sump backups. Everything was exactly where it should be. Across the way, I could see lights on in a few houses along the slope. People going about their evenings. Cooking. Watching TV. Trusting that the ground beneath them would behave the way it always had. That trust is powerful. And dangerous. The rain started just after midnight. Not sudden. Steady. Relentless. By 2 a.m., the sound had changed, from drops to sheets. Water began moving in places it hadn't before, testing every weak point quietly. I watched the monitors instead of the windows. Numbers matter more than noise. At 3:17 a.m., the first alert triggered, not from my system, but from the community group chat. Anyone else hearing weird cracking sounds? Is the road flooding near the cul-de-sac? My basement sump just kicked on again. I stayed quiet. At 3:42, my sensors showed exactly what I'd expected. Increased lateral pressure. Soil saturation at the threshold. Drainage channels performing as designed, moving water away instead of letting it pool. Then, somewhere downhill, something gave. I didn't hear it. I felt it. A low vibration. Brief. Final. 5 minutes later, the power flickered in the development. Streetlights went dark, then back on. The rain didn't change, but the silence did. That uneasy pause when systems fail before people understand why. At 4:06 a.m., the first emergency vehicles arrived. Not for me. For the houses closer to the slope. A retaining wall had collapsed behind one of them, dumping saturated earth straight into the foundation. Another followed minutes later, triggered by the same shift. Once the soil started moving, it didn't stop politely. It took the path of least resistance, straight through the things that had been built assuming it never would. I stood at my window and watched lights sweep across the neighborhood, flashing reds and blues reflecting off waterlogged streets. People in pajamas standing in the rain, trying to make sense of something that had never been part of the plan. My house didn't move. Not an inch. The drainage held. The supports absorbed the load. The water went where it was supposed to go, down and away. By sunrise, 3 houses were visibly damaged. One had partially collapsed at the rear. Another had shifted enough to make it unsafe to enter. The third looked intact until you noticed the cracks running diagonally through the exterior walls like a warning written in concrete. The HOA president arrived just after dawn. I recognized her car immediately. She stood with the others, arms crossed, staring at the damage. Listening to engineers explain soil failure, water pressure, and the risks of building on compromised ground without reinforcement. At one point, she looked up the slope. At my house. Perfectly still. Dry. Unmoved. Her expression wasn't anger. It was something worse. Recognition. Because in that moment, the joke she'd made weeks earlier came back to her. The one about seeing whose house stands. The storm had answered that question. And it hadn't been subtle about it. What came next wasn't shouting or blame. Not yet. It was something far more uncomfortable for people who dismissed the problem in the first place. They had to start explaining why the one house they mocked was the only one that didn't need emergency tape around it. And explanations are hard to improvise when the ground itself has already made the point for you. Daylight made everything worse. At night, damage hides behind shadows and rain. In the morning, it sits there, unapologetic. Mud pressed against walls. Foundations exposed where landscaping used to be. Yellow tape flapping uselessly in the breeze. Engineers moved slowly, deliberately, marking spots with spray paint. Red for unsafe. Blue for do not enter. Clipboards replaced umbrellas. The storm was over. The accounting had begun. The HOA president tried to take control. She gathered people near the entrance, speaking in that practiced, authoritative tone meant for meetings and newsletters. "We're assessing the situation," she said. This was an unforeseen event. Unforeseen. That word landed hard. Because the engineers didn't agree. I heard one of them explain it plainly to a homeowner. This slope has been marginal for years. The storm just pushed it past the limit. Another added, proper drainage and reinforcement would have reduced the risk significantly. Reduced. Not eliminated. But reduced mattered. The HOA president overheard that part. I watched her posture change, shoulders tightening, jaw setting. She asked if there was any way to determine which houses were properly reinforced. The engineer looked up the hill. "Yours wasn't," he said, gesturing vaguely to the damaged line. "But that one was." He pointed at my house. There was no drama in it. No accusation. Just fact. A few heads turned. Then more. Someone said, "Didn't he bring this up at a meeting?" Another replied, "Yeah, remember? They said it was overkill." The president didn't say anything. She didn't look at me either. By noon, insurance adjusters arrived. Different tone. Different questions. They wanted timelines. Reports. Prior notices. Anything that suggested risk had been identified before the storm. That's when my emails started circulating. Not because I shared them, but because they were already in HOA records. Requests. Warnings. Attachments. Engineer summaries. Time-stamped.
Documented.
The phrase prior knowledge began appearing in conversations. Quietly at first. Then more openly. The HOA board went into a closed session that afternoon. No agenda. No minutes. Just doors closed and voices raised enough that no one could quite hear words. Only urgency. When they came out, the president announced they'd hired an external firm to review infrastructure decisions. Translation. Someone was looking for a shield. Later that evening, she came to my door.
Not with a clipboard this time.
No audience.
No tone.
I need to ask you something, she said. I waited. Did you know this would happen? She asked. I shook my head.
No.
That part was true.
But you knew it could, she said.
Yes, I replied. That's why I prepared. She looked past me, at the house. At the dry ground. At the absence of damage. They said your setup might become a reference point, she said carefully. For what? I asked. For what should have been done. She didn't stay long after that. By the end of the week, 3 families were displaced. Temporary housing. Structural assessments. Long timelines. My house stayed open. Unrestricted. Unremarkable. And that contrast, the one no one could ignore anymore, became the center of every conversation. Not because I'd been right, but because the consequences had chosen a side. And now, the HOA had to answer a question they'd avoided for years. What do you do when preparation survives and denial doesn't? The tone of the neighborhood changed almost overnight. Not just sadness, though there was plenty of that, but unease. The kind that creeps in when people realize something wasn't random. When damage starts to look less like bad luck and more like a decision deferred too many times. The HOA stopped sending cheerful updates. Instead, residents received notices about assessments, inspections, and temporary adjustments to community standards. Lawn requirements were suspended. Exterior rules paused. Suddenly, aesthetics mattered less than stability. The external firm arrived 3 days later. Hard hats. Laser levels. Soil probes. They didn't talk much, but they asked pointed questions. About drainage plans. About previous reports. About why certain upgrades had been proposed and rejected. Those questions didn't stay private. By midweek, it was common knowledge that the HOA had been warned. That the risks weren't theoretical. That they'd been written down, emailed, discussed, and ultimately dismissed because they were inconvenient. The president tried to reframe it again. At a hastily scheduled town hall, held in the community center because several homes were now uninhabitable, she spoke about balancing cost with probability. About how no one could have predicted this exact outcome. She avoided looking uphill. Residents didn't. Someone stood up and asked why preventive reinforcement had been voted down when it was cheaper than emergency repair. Another asked why individual homeowners were now being assessed for damage tied to shared infrastructure failures. A third asked why the only house that came through untouched belonged to the person they'd mocked for being overprepared. There wasn't a good answer. The external firm released a preliminary finding the following week. It didn't assign blame, but it didn't need to. It outlined missed opportunities, deferred maintenance, known vulnerabilities left unaddressed. The words avoidable impact appeared twice. That phrase spread faster than any email. Insurance followed. Coverage disputes. Reservation of rights letters. The HOA's insurer began asking whether decisions had been made with full knowledge of the risk and whether that knowledge had been documented. It had. Every email I'd sent became part of the file. Not because I pushed them, but because they were already there.
Quiet.
Time-stamped. Waiting. The HOA president stopped leading meetings after that. Officially, she was focusing on recovery coordination. Unofficially, she'd lost the room. Every statement she made now met with skepticism. Every reassurance sounded hollow. Leadership shifted, not in a single vote, but in a dozen small ways. Another board member took over updates. Committees formed. Consultants were hired. And in the background, something else happened. People started copying me on things. Questions about drainage. About reinforcement. About inspections. They didn't ask for opinions, they asked for process.
Who to call?
what reports mattered, what preparation actually looked like. I answered when I could, briefly, factually, not to be helpful, to be accurate. Because the lesson wasn't about being right. It was about what happens when you ignore the people quietly trying to prevent a problem and only listen once the damage forces you to. By the time repairs began, the narrative had fully inverted. My safety setup wasn't overkill anymore. It was the baseline everyone wished they'd had. And the HOA, once confident, once dismissive, was now reacting instead of deciding. Which is the most expensive position you can ever put yourself in. The final reports arrived 6 weeks later.
Thick. Clinical.
Impossible to spin. They didn't name villains or heroes. They didn't need to. The timeline told the story better than any accusation ever could. Warnings issued, risks acknowledged, action deferred. Again and again. The storm hadn't caused the collapse. It had revealed it. Repairs stretched into months. Temporary walls became permanent ones. Budgets ballooned. Special assessments followed. Carefully worded letters explaining why everyone now had to pay for decisions made long before the rain ever fell. Some residents were angry. Others were quiet. A few apologized. Not to me directly, but in passing. A nod. A brief, "You tried to tell us." No speeches. No absolution. Just recognition. The HOA president resigned before the next quarterly meeting. No announcement. No farewell message. Her name simply disappeared from the letterhead, replaced by interim board coordinator. Leadership changed without ceremony, the way it often does when consequences arrive too clearly to argue with. The new board moved quickly. Drainage upgrades were approved unanimously. Retaining walls reinforced. Inspections scheduled annually instead of as needed. The same proposals that once drew laughter now passed without discussion. Cost was no longer the main concern. Risk was. As the neighborhood stabilized, so did something else, perspective. People stopped assuming stability meant safety. They stopped trusting that the ground beneath them would always behave just because it had yesterday. They started asking better questions. I didn't become a spokesperson. I didn't attend more meetings. I didn't gloat. I just stayed where I'd always been.
Prepared.
The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The safety setup that had once been mocked never had to prove itself again. It had already done its job. Quietly.
Completely.
Months later, a neighbor said something that stuck with me. "I used to think preparation was pessimism," she said. "Now I realize it's respect for reality." That was the real shift. Not the storm. Not the damage. Not even the collapse. It was the understanding that ignoring risk doesn't make it disappear. It just postpones the moment when it collects its debt. And when that moment comes, it doesn't care who laughed first. It only cares who listened. That's the part no one forgets. Not after watching denial sink and preparation stand.